All right, everybody, we are back. It is live, Jack Murphy Live. This is a special election update. We are checking in again with Matt Braynard, who is working on unearthing potential voter fraud across the country using very clear methods and procedures of data analysis. Matt, how are you doing, sir?
Better than Custer. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well myself. Big, exciting day today. Lots of stuff going on, so we're happy to check in with you. Last we left it, you had begun comparing national voting databases with folks who had moved out of district or perhaps died, etc. Could you give us an update on what happened with your research and what did you discover and where are we?
Sure. Well, I'm nearing the end of the analysis that I initially set out to do. There are two small components that I'm hoping to finish today and then release the full results with some insights tomorrow and potentially some conclusions. But all of our analysis, everything's out of the field. All the calls are done. There's just a little bit of crunching left to do. And of course, because it's very important we get this right, I've got to double check every number before I, put out the final report. But we found in every state people who've the state's marked as requesting an absentee ballot who say they did not request that ballot. We've found people in every state who says they returned the ballot, yet the state did not receive it. We've found people in every state whom the election officials have marked as having cast a ballot, yet they insist to us they did not. We've also found in every state people who are very likely in violation of the residency requirement, yet cast ballots anyway. And in every state, we've found people who have cast ballots in multiple states. So our findings across the board on all of our methods have been fairly fruitful. The only method of analysis that we did not really find anything of significance was among the votes cast in the name of the dead. So that really didn't return anything that suggested there was a targeted effort at that population.
Okay, and so just remind the listeners and the viewers what you guys did. You identified potential fraud and then you enlisted call centers to reach out and talk to all these people individually. How many phone calls did you guys make?
I mean, how many dials?
Yeah.
Probably well over 1 million. Probably 2 million dials. The data loads are pretty significant. Most nights when we went to the field, we're doing multiple nights trying to reach people who we couldn't reach the first night. So typically we'd be in the field between 2 and 3 nights to try to reach saturation on the list. And this is always, whether you're doing a survey research or voter ID program, call centers are expensive and they have the yield on them tends to be kind of low because everybody's got caller ID and we try to call cell phones when we can get it. But you start off with the entire population that you'd like to talk to. Then that gets narrowed down to the people you can get a cell phone or landline match to. And then you narrow that again to the numbers that are actually good, that aren't bad numbers, wrong numbers, only go to answering machines or have some other problem. Then you narrow that down to the people who will answer the first question or even talk to you. And then those will answer the second and third question. And that just kind of dramatically brings it down. So, but I think it's important to keep in mind that many of the numbers we're reporting, I mean, you could potentially use them to draw conclusions about the larger universe because, it is, in most cases, a valid sample size.
When you say you gave 4 examples, and I want to go back through them one more time, but you said in every state. And when you say every state, do you mean every state in the union or every state that you guys looked at?
Good question. The 6 states where we put our efforts or focused our efforts.
Okay, great. And when we talked before, you said there were potentially maybe 2 to 4 million calls to be made. You guys got 2 million calls out. That is incredible.
Right.
That's
about that many dials. The total universe of people we tried to reach probably came in a little bit closer to around 1.25. Like I don't want to speculate. I'll have the hard numbers tomorrow across all of it, but it is a very large number of people that we tried to reach, and how many of them actually got to the point where we could have a conversation. I think in many cases statistically significant numbers. And I mean, we didn't start this off trying to do projections. We were just trying to find living, breathing people whose account of reality was different from what the state boards of election was.
right. And could you just list one more time the 4 different cases that you guys were looking at, throwing out the dead people voting? What were the instances again that you had focused on?
Well, there were 6 analyses we ran across all of the states with one minor exception. And we'll throw out the dead analysis. 3 of those analyses were dependent upon call centers. One was we reached out to people who had filed a national change of address from their address of record and called to ask them whether or not they had actually cast the ballot when the state said they did. Second group is similar to that. We reached out to people who had never voted before or freshly registered or hardly ever voted before in precincts with unusually high turnout and asked them whether or not they cast a ballot. And we found many of those. The third was we reached out to people whom the state said they sent an absentee ballot but didn't return it. And we asked whether or not they did request that ballot. Many of them said no. And these are all states where you're required to personally request it. Somebody else can't do it for you without some kind of special authorization. And we also asked them if they did request the ballot, did you cast it? Because they said yes, well, the state hadn't recorded themselves as receiving it or having counted it. So those were the three analysis that are call center. The other two are looking for people who didn't meet residency requirements. We did that through NCOA and through looking at other states where they made a subsequent registration to vote. And the other is looking for people who cast multiple ballots in multiple states. So we look, and that's only for early absentee voters in both states. When we finally, if we do get access to election day voters, we'll be able to probably find a lot more of them, cases where somebody, say, cast an absentee ballot in Georgia but voted in person in South Carolina, for example.
Got it. And of those categories, was there one that stood out? It sounds to me these are people whose ballots were maybe cast on their behalf, ballots that they cast weren't recorded, ballots they didn't ask for being recorded, or people who didn't get their ballots, what happened to their votes? Is there one of these that happened to have higher incidences or seem to be more frequent?
I think that for the cases where people said I did not vote, yet a ballot was cast in my name, the numbers of those that we reached is relatively low. But when you think about the percentages, and you also think about how difficult it is to find somebody who's willing to admit that or talk on the phone about it, and how it just narrows the universe, I think those findings are actually significant. The residency requirements are very significant. In the state of Georgia, we've identified over 20,000 people who have strong indications of no longer meeting residency requirements to vote in that state, which is far more than the margin of victory. And then we've had some of the people we're working with, I don't really want to disclose, but let's just, people who are affiliated, associated with some of the president's efforts in court and related, parallel efforts in court, did commission a study by a tenured professor who took our early absentee numbers, our unreturned absentee numbers in Pennsylvania and projected them to the entire universe of unreturned absentee ballots, and found that a significant number, based on his analysis, of votes actually weren't counted, because again, we just have a sample size and projected it to the entire universe. And all of these are troubling across all these states. It's just a troubling number. And, in the course of doing this, we've actually discovered another anomaly that we weren't even looking for in the state of Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, you have to show ID to cast an absentee ballot. They make it very difficult to do so. But there's one loophole for people who are indefinitely confined. Now, this loophole allows somebody to request an absentee ballot without showing an ID. Now, historically, there have only been a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people that have requested an absentee ballot under the status in previous elections. This election, there were over 200,000 people in Wisconsin who requested an absentee ballot on this basis. Now, to clarify, COVID does not qualify you as being indefinitely confined. But it's clear that most of those do not meet the requirement. We're finding different ways to investigate that. In fact, one of the legal teams we're partnered with has this list of names, and they're or doing a sample of it, trying to look for evidence on, say, Facebook and other social media of these people going out and playing football or soccer games, because this category is really divided, really for your grandmother who's bedridden and can't leave the house, very narrow. And another thing that suggests that there's tremendous fraud here is that or at least one of the county clerks encouraged people to fraudulently claim this status, posted it on social media, and then the Wisconsin Supreme Court had to order them to take it down. Given how close the margin is in Wisconsin, again, that is a big red flag.
Wait, there's somebody who publicly instructed voters to basically commit voter fraud, circumvent the rules, or
not just somebody, but the Board of Elections for a particular county in Wisconsin did that. And they were ordered by the Supreme Court to pull that social media post because it was in violation of the law.
I'm practically speechless at that one. The category that strikes me is I didn't vote, but a vote was cast on my behalf. Can you give me some idea of the numbers we're talking about there?
So we attacked this from two different angles. The first is we reached out to people who had filed national change of address. The idea being that if you're going to do, you can't manufacture votes and just inject them into a system. Those votes, ideally, need to, you can't have more ballots cast than people who signed up to vote that day, right? Because if those numbers are different, especially by the significant numbers that, people are speculating happened, you just can't get away with it. But what you have to do is get people's names marked off as having voted and then inject ballots. If you're running some kind of major fraud operation, and the way you would do that is you find people who had not cast a ballot in a long time. This is publicly available information, and then cast ballots in their name, because then it's unlikely that they show up and say, "Hey, I cast a ballot." Although Rudy spoke about this in his press conference today, because if somebody shows up and says they cast a ballot, they say, "Wait, you did an absentee," that throws up a red flag. So they want to avoid this. The way you avoid it is to cast ballots in names of people who haven't voted in a long time. One reason somebody hasn't voted in a long time is because they moved away. The second reason is, well, they just aren't interested, or maybe they're freshly registered. Maybe the same operation that's casting the ballot is also registering people. So in terms of people who moved away, we reached out to them, and going across the state, at least my numbers, we found in as many as 2.73% of the NCOAs who had ballots cast in their name said they didn't cast the ballot. Now, 2.73, big deal, right? That's in Nevada, big deal, right? But then when you think about how many of those ballots were cast and speculate, if you project that number more broadly, what the implications are. We didn't have many recordings of this in Pennsylvania, but in all the other states, Georgia 1.5%, Nevada 2.7%, Michigan 1.4%, Wisconsin 1.1%, and Arizona 0.4%. So that's of the people who moved. Now, when we looked at we looked at precincts that had unusually high turnout and reached out to people who had never voted before, or maybe voted once. Either they just got registered, or they've been registered for a while, but just basically no vote activity. And then we just randomly called a population, we pulled 30 to 40,000 cell phone numbers out of these heavy turnout precincts and asked, "Hey, did you cast that ballot?" Now, overwhelmingly, people said yes, they did. But going state to state, again, a very high number in Nevada, 2.2% said, "No, I didn't cast that ballot." In Michigan, 2.8% said, "No, I did not cast a ballot." About a percent in Arizona, 6.66% in Wisconsin, 0.85% in Georgia, 0.7% in Pennsylvania. So the question is, was it just clerical error, or the people lying, or was there some organized effort? And we just happen to get the traces, because our test method is not that different from, say, when you go get the COVID test. They don't analyze your whole body to see if you have COVID. They take a sample of your blood and look for COVID antibodies. And this is the equivalent of a COVID antibody.
Right. Has there been studies like this done on past data sets? Is there a historical record to compare against? Is there a trend? Is this an anomaly? Is it possible it's like this every single time that there's an election? What sort of historical context can you give us for this?
No one's ever done this before, and I don't know. But
Wow.
I also think that it doesn't matter, because I think if the defense here is that, well, this happens every election, is not that may be a fact, but that's not an excuse, or that's not a reason to overlook it. That's just a reason to have skepticism, perhaps, about elections in the past.
Right.
And in most cases in elections in this country, the margin of victory is large enough that it overshadows any vote manipulation that could have taken place intentionally or accidental. It's the margin is so much bigger that it doesn't really matter. But now that we have not only close elections, but close elections in many states, and it's such a pivotal election, well, now it's under the magnifying glass. And I may have said this before to you. I know I said it before elsewhere, is that if you recall what happened in Florida in 2000, where it was just a couple hundred votes, it laid bare all of the problems with the election system in Florida.
Right.
The reality is that if any state had an election that close and it was that important, you'd find all the same problems in every state.
Right. You've mentioned occasionally by design, maybe, or an operation. How much of this are individual actors potentially acting in a fraudulent manner versus some level of coordinated effort? Maybe it's speculation on your part here, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
I believe, and this isn't really speculation, I'm just thinking about the mechanics of how it would have to work, that double voting, if the person did cast the 2 votes, it's a lot of, or maybe somebody's, well, let's just think about how it could happen, right? If somebody decides to double vote, they decide to cast maybe 1 ballot, but they cast in a state they no longer reside because they think, oh, my vote's not going to count here in South Carolina, so I'm going to count in Georgia, or cast in Georgia where it can make a difference. People can, on their own initiative, say, fill out the absentee ballot request or return a ballot that's not their, doesn't have their name on it, but just came to their address because, the Board of Elections is not particularly rigorous in maintaining the hygiene of their data. But there's also indications that, it's done en masse by individuals and, deciding whether it's one or the other, or again, there's the third option, clerical error. That requires some real investigation to do something other than speculate. And one thing as I've tried to avoid doing is talking about things I don't know for a fact or just speculating. So I'm just sort of describing to you the 3 potential ways this could have happened. I think what it does raise is pressure to find out what actually did happen for a fact and figure out which one of those methods it actually was.
Right. And in your efforts, you've made phone calls, you reached people finally, and people have confirmed one way or the other whether they cast the vote or they didn't, or they moved or hadn't. The net result of those efforts are what? Sworn affidavits or declarations or people willing to come forth as witnesses? Is this count as evidence?
Well, our effort after the initial call center reaches out to these people and we find an answer that's a red flag, we reach out to them with our in-house call center to try to get them to sign declarations. However, as of now, we also have a team of attorneys that are working on these people to collect affidavits. The distinction really being is that one of them is notarized, the other one is not, but they're both done under penalty of perjury. So, and I've myself have won federal cases just with declarations, but in some state cases, if these go to court and in state level, they require affidavits. So that's more of a legal question. But what I also have in many cases, almost all the cases, is audio recordings of these phone calls where we say, "Hi, is this Jack Murphy?" "Yes, it's Jack Murphy." We have the phone number, that's your phone number, and we ask whether or not you cast the ballot, and you say no. So that's also a different form of evidence.
Have you had any particularly high-profile cases? I mean, like public figures or anyone like that?
You mean that we discover a high-profile person?
Yeah, like a public figure. I think I heard that there was like an Olympic-level athlete.
Yes,
perhaps.
yes,
Yeah.
that was interesting. What's noteworthy about this discovery is that we never actually talked to him. We just left him a voice message saying that, hello, Nashawn Garrett. The state says a ballot was cast in your name. If the ballot was not cast, please call it back. You may be the victim of voter fraud. And he had a pretty big Twitter following, and he started investigating it and finding that not only was a ballot cast in his name in Arizona, but it was marked as signature verified.
Wow.
And he, I guess he caught somebody's eye because he ended up on Laura Ingram's show in primetime on Fox News, talking about his victimization of clerical error or somebody cast a ballot in his name without his knowledge. So
since we talked last, you had when we first talked, you had just canceled your vacation. You weren't really happy about it. You're dedicated to unearthing anything that needed to be uncovered here. You just got it started on this. Compare your mood or vibe on this today versus your mood or vibe on this when you started. Do you think that you're going to end up with something productive? I mean, productive in terms of uncovering fraud? Are you feeling energized about it, even though it's a negative for America? It could be a positive depending on your perspective. But is it what you thought it was going to be when you set forth? Are you feeling more energy around it? Are you feeling encouraged or discouraged?
Well, the results I don't think would have affected because I didn't go into this. I wasn't trying to find something specific. I didn't have a predetermined answer. And all I knew is that, look, I wanted to put these forward and I don't know, something like 7,000 donors stepped forward and said, hey, we want to contract you to do this research. And, after spending, I guess now over $600,000 on data and call centers and and some staff and some other things. Although again, as I promised at the beginning, I'm not taking a penny of any of the money raised through the GoFundMe or Give Send Go. I hope these people find that the results are, because one of the messages I got constantly is that I don't necessarily want you to discover voter fraud. I just don't want you to discover whether this was a clean election, whether this president is legitimately elected. So I'm going to put forward some information tomorrow that will help people draw those conclusions. I'll share my own conclusions. But I'll be honest with you, now that a lot of the hard work has been done, at least for the initial, this initial investigation, I'm very, I've got a good night's rest last night, so that's good. And and it's coming together. It's coming together, and I think that people will be satisfied with the thoroughness of this work. And there's also in the coming days, I'm likely going to be working with several different legal teams to make this stuff a little bit more actionable.
Right. Well, that is fantastic. I know we've only got a couple minutes left here. Have you had any coordination with Sidney Powell or Rudy or the campaign at a high level? Are you still doing this sort of independently? What is the level of teamwork that's happening here?
Remember this, in many cases, there are teams working in each of the states. So we have shared information with several of those teams that they're making use of it in different ways. There's also some other legal operations that are operating in parallel, who are having their own conversations, which we're supporting. So, I don't want to make any kind of official statement about cooperation per se, but just know that this and all of these findings are many of the right people within the organizations within the campaign know about it, and we're hard at work trying to make it actionable.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. I really, truly appreciate your time. Can you give us an idea of what to look for tomorrow? When is the announcement? What is the official title of whatever it is you're delivering tomorrow? Tease us on that.
Well, this would be the conclusions of the voter integrity project as we found them. And I'll probably post a video of me going through the spreadsheet where I have all the numbers, talking about how they were generated, and offering maybe a few thoughts of my own on it. I don't have a firm time. Again, I don't have quite the media savvy or establishment that you do. So this whole operation was very seat of the pants. But that's the plan for tomorrow. And then, there's a lot of data that I want to put out and make public, like the top lines for the phone surveys, that kind of thing. One thing I'm trying to avoid doing, at least until it comes time to drop something in the courtroom, is actually dropping names of people, because I don't want to necessarily dox folks or who've stepped forward and said, yes, I'll sign a declaration. Or, if I put out a list of people we found to have cast 2 ballots, it doesn't necessarily mean that they cast those 2 ballots. It just means that 2 are cast in their registration they have in one state and their registration in another state. So again, I'm very careful about putting out lists of names, but I'll put out all the top line numbers. And another thing, again, because I want to make sure that this is, above the board ethically, we'll probably be bringing some kind of person to audit so that they can see that the money that I said was spent, because I've got a stat. Believe it or not, in 2020, to send a wire, you actually still have to go into the bank. I spent a lot of the bank walking into these, sending. I think the largest wire at one point was over $250,000 to one of our phone centers. So so I just need somebody to validate that all these wires happened, et cetera, so that we've got a real grift problem on the right. And I want to make it clear that I'm not part of it, and I want somebody independent to come take a look and confirm that for me.
There's grift everywhere. It's not confined to one element or the other. And I'm surprised you can't just Apple Pay $250,000 through a text message these days, Matt. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. I can't wait to see what you uncovered tomorrow. And it is a good point to point out to the readers and viewers. The people whose names are on the ballot are likely victims, not perpetrators of any fraud. They're just sort of been caught up in it and used. So if there are names out there, these aren't American villains. These aren't the terrible people per se. Oftentimes it looks like they were just caught up in something and they were just being used. So Matt, thanks very much. I look forward to your stuff for tomorrow. Thanks for coming on and giving us an update, and I appreciate it. And Godspeed to you, man.
Thank you very much. We'll talk again sometime.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Bye-bye.